What I want to talk about today is, the title is End-to-End Device Management and the potential for a new approach. So those of you who've seen me present before will know that what I tend to do is take you on a bit of a journey, talk about where we were, what we need to do now, and how this can potentially be extrapolated out into the future, and indeed what we're doing at Coacho. So to move things on, so first of all, a little bit about me. Why should you listen to me? So I'm obviously product director here at Coacho. I've been at Coacho now for 2 years and came in as part of the acquisition of Mobility. I was CTO at Mobility before. More relevant for this conversation is prior to that, I was at HSBC Bank for a very long time, man and boy. And I, over the years, did a number of pieces of work around the endpoint estate. So the deployment and support of endpoints across all kinds of technology, and I'll touch on some of the technologies that go back to the dim, distant mists of time, and how they're casting quite a long shadow still in some ways. So there's a bit there. So I've got the experience in the world of Windows, I've got the experience in the world of mobile as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how building in the world of Windows and the journey it goes on, and therefore you go on alongside it. How potentially you can take the journey to modern itself and a different way of approaching things across all your endpoint estate, and some of this new thinking. So how do you take the technology and actually take it a step further? So without further ado, building the world of Windows. So we're obviously in the world of Windows 11 now. We are clearly building on the foundations that came in Windows 10. So obviously anyone who's not aware that Windows 10 is going end of life, there's been quite a lot of news around that. In fairness, many organizations are potentially on the path to Windows 11, but there are still those that we're having quite a lot of conversations around now about, right, okay, Windows 10, we've got to get off it, we've got a year left. So it's important. The point I always make about Windows in general is it's actually got quite, I describe it as it's dragging around quite a long tail. Windows itself, if you scratch beneath the surface of Windows 11, you're obviously talking about an operating system that's been around for a while. There's Windows 8, if we go back in time. No one talks about Windows 8 anymore. That was kind of like the one that you don't talk about. But what we do all know and love and remember will be Windows 7. So Windows 7 obviously was generally the operating system that businesses and enterprises were on before they jumped to Windows 10. Anyone who's still got some of those knocking around, you really need to get those modernized now, but believe it or not, we're still coming across them. As is often the case with the world of Windows, we jump back at, anyone remember Vista? So that's that. It's funny how this is segmenting into a couple of columns here, isn't it? But yeah, Windows Vista is obviously the one that generally you tried it at home and you're like, ooh, I'm maybe not ready for that in my work life at the moment. So everyone stayed on Windows XP. So my career, I jumped, if you like, from the world of Windows XP, as it was back then. I'd helped deploy the first unified Windows XP build in HSBC across the UK. Across the globe, I should say. And that was quite a jump. They offered me the job to do Windows 7 when it came along, and I was like, I think I've had enough of this. Thank you very much. That was 250,000 desktops that we had to deploy. We go back in time, though, and I think this is important because Windows 2000 is 24 years ago, to state the blindingly obvious. But actually, a lot of the technology infrastructure that underpins this, Active Directory, the way you've architected your world, there's still the legacy of Windows 2000 sitting there underpinning a lot of this. And in actual fact, Windows NT is sitting underneath the surface of that. And that's where I started. So I deployed the first unified Windows NT build for the UK in HSBC Bank, which was extremely unpopular because before that, even in a major global bank, some of you are probably a bit too young for this, but hands up if you remember installing Windows from one of these. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. Fabulous. I mean, this is a later edition. It's actually got an integrated service pack. Look at that. So the world of Windows NT, the point I make here is there's not that long ago that actually the process for building a machine was literally someone had to rock up. If you were lucky, it had a CD drive in it, and you could actually stick the CD in and start from there. There's a whole world of pain beyond that if you didn't have a CD drive in it, but we'll skip over that. The idea that you could shove a USB in the front was just alien as well. But what came along, and the point I make here is, does anyone remember this, by the way? Yeah. So this was a godsend when it arrived. So this is how we could deploy a standard unified Windows NT build across the UK, because this thing appeared, Norton Ghost. I loved this tool. You could sysprep an image. You could actually create a single unified build. This was the emergence of the build. Yeah, the birth of the build. And the point about the build is that if most of your machines basically look very similar from an application perspective, then clearly why would you spend all that time and effort sending engineers to desks to manually install operating system and software? It's obvious now with the benefit of hindsight. There was clearly massive savings there, and most organizations will remember well the gold standard, the build, the image that you would install. And it worked brilliantly. Let's be honest, that saved us a ton of time and effort compared to building machines manually every single time and it going wrong and it taking time and all kinds of other things, and then it was inconsistent, and how the hell do you even consider patching it? Patching it wasn't even something you really even bothered about back then, but there we go. The point I make here is this is where most organizations built their processes for Windows. These are, the foundation stones on which the way you think about a machine and how you will create it from scratch or rebuild it or support it, that's where they were created. And generally, those processes are still knocking around 25 years later. We are a quarter of a century later, and basically you're doing it the same way quite often. I'm not saying always, but this is where the thinking, the way you would architect your not only the way you build the machine, the way you buy machines, the way you will supply those machines, the way they come into a central IT team and they get built out and then shipped on again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this mirrors my career. So having turned down the polite offer to go and deploy Windows 7, I went off into a parallel universe, which was this world. Anyone remember that one? Okay. So this is actually the BlackBerry 8700. I actually started quite a bit before that. I couldn't find a high-resolution image of any older BlackBerry than this. So that's why you're seeing an 8700, although it was a very popular device. So obviously, this parallel world of the mobile estate started to build up, normally totally separate from the way you thought about doing a Windows machine. And indeed, not long after BlackBerry, in fact, I'd recommend the BlackBerry movie if you've not seen it, by the way. It's an absolutely brilliant watch that kind of describes the roller coaster of how these geeks basically took over the world and then lost it. But point being, and then the iPhone came along. So that's iPhone 1. And this is the arrival of the mobile estate. Now, there are some fundamental things. I mean, it kind of challenged the narrative on every single level when it came to adopting it into the corporate space. It was purchased differently. You traditionally buy a block of machines, they'd arrive on a pallet, and then you'd build them and ship them in the Windows world. It didn't work like that. They were integrated into airtime agreements, and you had to go and talk to your carrier who helped you buy Nokias before and all this kind of good stuff. So they were very different. They didn't fit the mold, and you built them differently, which meant you then had to support them completely differently. And so it was literally like two different camps. It was two different ways of working. Now, the point here is these devices were born to live on the internet by default. A carrier network is the internet by default. Now, back on the days of BlackBerry, you used to call it the BlackBerry NOC, but fundamentally what you were talking about was a cloud. You couldn't even turn the thing on without the cloud to activate it. In fact, if you try and power up one of these old devices, it won't work anymore. But what they were was a signpost to the future in many ways. So the way you approach things had to be built differently, but actually what they've done is created a model, which is the journey to the modern way of working. So whether it's Windows 10, it's introduced on Windows 10, or whether it's Windows 11 going forwards, from a technology perspective, we're now in a position where using the power of the cloud, in this case the Microsoft cloud, so we've obviously got AAD joined devices rather than the old on-prem domain world. We've got Microsoft Intune as the management layer. And crucially, that whole thing about building it over the air and integrating it into your environment without actually touching it, we've got autopilot. So that's been around for a little while. That's obviously, for some organizations, baked into some of the processes on Windows 10. Now, that's definitely the model going forwards. If you're thinking about deploying Windows 11 using your gold standard image, please don't. You've got to at some point get on board with this. This is the world we're going to. Now, the point I try and make here is it's not just about the technology. It's about changing the thinking around the technology as well. So clearly, you've got to modernize the tool sets, so use the autopilot, etc. But once again, and I've used this phrase a lot through the years, use mobile as a bit of a signpost to the future. It came along and challenged the model first, so it's an opportunity to take some of the lessons and learnings from that world as well. You can add in automation and integration of process to the way you do this so that things can be done very differently in the future and actually do things differently. Think about your processes and all the things that currently sit around an endpoint and think about doing them differently, because very often one of the things that I try and encourage people to do when they're on this journey is talk about scenarios. So don't think about machine scenarios, because most of your Windows-based processes may potentially be built around machine. It's machine fault. It is machine ship. It is machine deploy. It's not about user-based scenarios. Those user-based scenarios are far more interesting to your end user estate, obviously, because funnily enough, these endpoints are the face of IT. So one of the things we really try and do is talk to people and say, now imagine a user-first process. So basically, start with identity. What, onto a farm? Right, okay, so start with identity and integrate that into the world of devices. So this is a busy slide, and I don't apologize for it. You will, as has already been mentioned, get a copy of these slides. But the point we're talking about here is let's talk about a scenario and think about how we use the technology for end user benefit. So let's start with the classic joiner process. So this is the number one thing. The first time a user will interact with IT is going to be when they join an organization. So we're going to talk about this one in detail, but in principle, imagine a whole suite of these that talk about someone moves department, someone leaves the organization, or you can start to talk about someone has a support issue. All of these are moments in a user's journey, and start with that as the starting point. So crucially, start with a master source of truth. Start with your HR system. Now, this actually sends shivers sometimes into the HR department, I hate to say it, because, oh no, you can't use that data because it's not particularly accurate. And of course, the answer is, well, clean the data up and then actually automate based on it, not just try and create a manual fudge because you don't trust the data set. You've got to have a trusted master source of truth for some of this stuff, and the HR system is logically where it should sit. So in this example, we're using a Bamboo HR. Many other HR platforms are available, and it doesn't really matter. The point is you've got a database somewhere we can point at. Now, what we can then start to do using our skills on Entra is we can automatically provision the user into Entra. So that sounds really obvious. But then nicely, because most organizations are still in a legacy state, we can also write back to on-prem Active Directory as well. That's all synchronization stuff going on in the background. And logically, we can start to provision access to applications that the user needs to have based on their role. We can start to provision all of the cloud services and set up all their access into Office 365. We can even do, bear in mind, I'm not even talking about an endpoint yet, but this is really important. What we've also done is provision the user into Exchange. We've got the new email address, because no one knows what it is yet, because you can't guarantee first name dot last name is available. So that's written back to the HR system, which then becomes the master source of truth, so you know it. So we then get to the actual workflow of the endpoint. Now you can start to trigger a device process. You can start talking about device lifecycle, and I will in a minute in a bit more detail. So you can start to do a process on the device itself. You can set the user up so that they've set themselves up with their own password. It's not written on a post-it note when you arrive, and all the classic hacks that everybody does. So the point being, the user has actually set their own password as part of the process. And clearly, everybody's in the loop, they're aware of what's going on, and it's all therefore approved appropriately as may need to do. Now that is a busy slide on purpose, but that, as far as the end user is concerned, looks very cool. Now, when we talk about the device lifecycle, this is where we potentially come in. Why do you want to do build, shipping, logistics, the ability to range devices, decide which devices you want to do, dealing with approvals for devices, fulfillment, stock, you name it, and end of life. These are all things that your IT teams potentially have to do. It's really quite low value work in terms of skilled resources you're having to pay and have on your payroll. You can do this. Those processes we run, doesn't really matter what device it is, doesn't matter if it's Windows, you can do the same thing for Mac. You can do the same thing on your mobile estate. You can do the same thing no matter what the type of flavor of Microsoft Windows device is, whether you want Microsoft hardware, whether you've got your choice of provider. It's all just an endpoint, and it doesn't really matter. What it is about end user experience. So imagine a world where new joiner, this is an example where we did, it goes to the manager. So we don't trust the end user to choose their device, so the manager has to do it for them. So this is a scenario, obviously, where you have to choose what type of device this person is going to get. We could also automate that, but this is an example where the manager gets to choose. Or if you're really brave, why not let people choose for themselves, and then they'll actually look after it because they've got the device they actually wanted in the first place. It's an interesting thought process, and one that mobile is quite popular on as well. So that's a good example there. But you can also start to automate all kinds of email processes that go into this. Again, this was all linked to device, but not just about device. So imagine, before you even join on your personal email, you've had this saying, oh, congratulations, we can see you're joining. Why, here's some instructions on what to do and what will be going on. Imagine that, assuming they're on a notice period, you send them regular updates. You can start to have this kind of stuff. Now, this may look a little cheesy, but imagine if you're the actual end user on the end of this process. This is actually pretty cool, right? We even go as far as saying, why not have all your devices come in one box? So here's your smartphone, here's your laptop, it arrives on your desk. You can even brand the box if you really want to. We can do all of that for you. So that's the idea of what we're doing here. So, get the right kit for the right role, clearly, but don't just think about autopilot as a process renewal and then bolt it into an old process. Think about more holistic end user journey and automate it wherever you can. And so, yeah, quick summary from me, because I'm nearly out of time. Think about this, that you're dealing with processes that, so we all know the concept of technical debt is quite common now. Think about process debt. Some of the processes you've got potentially in your endpoint estate could have been knocking around for a really long time, and challenge them. This is a great moment to do that. Windows 11 is a very good platform with all of the technical tools available to do this. And as I mentioned before, think about the way the world of mobile is potentially different and how you can use that as an example to apply a bit of innovative thinking in here. And look, end of the day, what we've described is not secret to us. These are us making new world processes on top of the technology available. But look, if you want to, we can literally do all of that for you. We'll come in and just do the whole lot and do it effectively, device as a service.